everyone, and welcome back. Today I'm going to be sharing some of my family history with you. That's because I'm fortunate enough that I not only have a lot of records of my family, names and dates and the such, but I also actually have quite a few physical objects, which we aren't going over today, such as a spinning wheel and some furniture, but I also have a lot of photographs. A lot. I also have an excessive quantity of slides from my grandfather, who got a hold of a camera sometime in the 1930s and never stopped taking pictures of people when they didn't want to have them taken, it seems. He loved candid shots. But we're not going to talk about that stuff today. We're going to focus on those older photographs, the style that you see in just giant stacks when you go into antique stores that usually come with no names, no dates, barely any information on them, maybe a stamp from the photographer, and that's it. I'm fortunate enough that most of my family photos not only have names written on the back, but I have the information of who those people are, when they were born and died, all of those things, all of the relationships and details. Some of them aren't fully correct, some of them had some mystery around them or missing pieces, lots of nicknames. That's always confusing. But I started looking into putting dates to these and discovered pretty quickly that there are all these wonderful stories that I unearthed by doing so. Because it's not only great to be able to put dates to these photographs, regardless of whether you know who's in them or not, in order to better understand fashion history and clothing, but if you have any other additional information, it can really tell you a lot about the people, their relationships, and the time that they lived in and the situation that they were in. Because, well, honestly, we tend to have this idea that in the past, people who weren't living in major cities, who weren't really young and really rich, didn't really participate in fashion in the same way. They might buy something every year, but it's mostly practical clothing. They have a nice gown for church, but it's going to be a few years out of date most of the time, and they're just really not able to keep up with that sort of stuff since they can't just walk down the street and purchase really fancy things. The reality is that while there are definitely examples of all of those things, and there are examples of people who qualify on all of those but don't care about fashion, this is not something we should broadly apply to everybody because it's not really that universal. Yes, we think of clothing as more expensive and dear in the past, and it was in a way, but they also had a lot less to spend money on. They didn't have cell phones and electronics and cars and all of the bills that went with all of the things that we have today. They didn't have those. That money could go to clothing or any other things. And my family, which is a really typical, common family, is a great example of that. All of the people I'm going to show you today are farmers in Indiana. This is a map for those that don't know roughly where that is. They are specifically in Frankfort, Indiana, which if it looks like it's the middle of nowhere, it does kind of also feel like that. Today it is a city of about 15 or 16,000 people. Historically, looking at 1850, it was about 500 people. By the time we reached 1920, it was about 10,000. The railroad came in and there was a decent amount of industry there, but that's as big as it grew in the time that we're going to be looking at. It's not a big city, and it's, even in modern day, almost an hour away from Indianapolis, which is the capital city, and that's still not a huge city compared to a lot of others in the country. So theoretically, you would think this not wealthy, mind you, family, because this is the house that they decided to stop and take pictures of. This was something that they felt needed to be noted. In reality, this was my great-grandmother's house, built by my great-grandfather. They had 4 children in there, and knowing my grandfather and his siblings, I don't know how. I barely fit up the staircase in that house. I don't know how they managed it. But none of the families I'm showing you today were wealthy. They weren't of note. They don't show up in a lot of city records because they just were typical farmers of the era. Granted, they could go into town. It wasn't that far. They went in usually once a week, according to oral family history. And there were plenty of fashionable stores in town in the square. There are records of a milliner, a gown maker, tailors, all sorts of fashionable items being available in this tiny little town of just a couple thousand people. So it was clearly available to them, and to be honest with you, as you're gonna see, they took advantage of it. They really did. I have the most amazing family. But all this video is not just to show you my family history, it's to talk about how I actually put dates on these pictures, because getting specific years helped me to better understand what's going on and actually changed my opinion of what was going on in some of the pictures and who I thought some of the people were. So I really wanted to explore how I go about that, not just from the aspect of a fashion historian, but also looking at family records, which is why I was very fortunate that this week the sponsor of the video is MyHeritage. If you've ever wanted to explore your family history just a little bit further and find all the lost names and stories, MyHeritage is a place for family history research. It's actually the #1 family history service in Europe. You don't need much information. Once I added my great-grandparents, it took off with recommendations on so many other relatives and records. Though I have pretty decent notes on some of my family, I still have loads of dead ends and mysteries. Especially when it comes to immigration or the people that moved around a bunch. My favorite moments come in finding census records where I can see where my family lived, what jobs they had, and who they lived with. And MyHeritage has more than 15 billion historical records to search. In doing research for this video, I managed to reconnect photographs to distant relatives that weren't recorded in any of our old paperwork. The stories I had associated with those photos completely changed once I knew who they actually were and when they were taken. You can clean up damage, enhance blurry faces, and even add color to black and white images. Discovering the vivid colors of these dresses and backgrounds has been so much fun. Seriously, look at these curtains. You better believe I'm going to be using this feature on so many fashion photographs as well. To access all of this, just sign up for a 14-day free trial and enjoy all of the features that MyHeritage has to offer. If you decide to continue your subscription, you'll get a 50% discount. No matter how much or how little you know about your history, the stories are there just waiting to be discovered. Thanks again to MyHeritage for sponsoring this week's video and really helping me out when it came to figuring out all of those census records that allowed me to solve many of today's mysteries. The first thing I think we really should cover before we get into the fashion history portion is photography. So obviously the history of photography can greatly affect the dates that you're going to actually see for any of these photographs. First off, we have 1839 when daguerrotypes were invented. Daguerre had been working on that particular style of photography for a while. That doesn't make it super popular or super common yet because it has to be taken and processed on site. So this is not something that you can easily travel with. It's not something that is a simple process. It is a while to sit and let it expose and involves a lot of chemicals. So the years after this are really working towards things like being able to make multiple images. In 1841, we have the calotype, which allowed negatives for multiple images. So you could take one picture and get multiple images in its printed form out of that. This is using paper for that process. In 1851, a similar process is figured out to use glass for the negative, which makes it a much more precise, detailed negative. So you can get a much better repeated photograph off of that. But we're still in the situation of really doing that best in a studio or a very controlled circumstance. In 1879, they figure out dry plate processes, which mean that you can take the picture, keep the plate dry, and then go finish it and process it elsewhere. So you no longer need an entire studio set up with you, you just need the camera set up and you can actually do the negative processing in a separate space, which is really convenient. So that makes it much easier to take photographs out and about of people and houses and things like that without needing to set up an entire darkroom in order to process it immediately. In 1889, we move on to a flexible film for negatives, so now we can have a film roll. So suddenly it becomes even easier to do these sorts of things. You don't have entire big plates for the photographs, you just have a little roll of film. And that's really when it explodes and you start seeing a lot more people get photographs taken as of the 1880s and 1890s. This keeps building throughout the early 20th century. 35mm for filming movies comes out in 1913, and by the 1920s they've figured out how to do that for photography as well. And more people, as of the beginning part of the 20th century, especially once you reach the 1920s and 30s, are getting their own personal cameras. It's no longer a photo studio, a professional photographer, it is an at-home thing that you can do. So the types of photographs that you're going to see early on are those metal plate photographs, like we think of tin types and all those printed cabinet cards from the rest of the 19th century. Really, we're seeing a lot of more 1860s through the 19-teens, and then the more casual photography that we're used to coming out in the 1920s and onwards. So already we've kind of started to narrow down most of when the photographs are going to be from. We're not going to find photographs from 1782. We don't have to look that far back. We're also going to start seeing dramatic changes in the style of photographs as of the 19 teens and 20s. So this card style, this photograph style, is really going to be mostly centered maybe 1850 through 1920. So that's the era that I am specifically looking at with my own family because I have that full range and frankly more. In terms of dating by fashion, this is a really large and complex topic. And in reality, this is not something I can condense down into just a few minutes within this video. So eventually I will be doing timelines of fashion where I can really get into details of different elements and parts, but for right now, this is what I've drawn up. This kind of gives you an idea of what we consider a silhouette, but in reality, I want you to think more of where the emphasis lies. Where does your eye go first? Where do you immediately look at and go, wow, that part's really big, like those are huge sleeves, or that's a really big skirt, or wow, they really made the bodice super long on that one. Like, what's with the really low V in front? What is drawing your eye first? What defines that era? Because there are going to be so many different styles within each one of these eras. There's not one single style, one single sleeve, one single skirt style. For men, obviously, there's not as much of a stark difference, but there are subtle things that adjust in terms of the shape and size of the lapels, the way the coat fits, the way the collar fits, what sort of tie they're wearing. And of course, another great thing to do is start looking at hair. Hairstyles for women and men, and facial hair, especially for men, can really be very obvious of the era. If you look down below in the description, I have a ton of links to different resources to start looking into the details more, whether it's year-by-year fashion plates or summations of how hairstyles changed or things like that. Just how do I go about this research? I generally start by knowing roughly what era I'm looking for, and then I dive into Pinterest. My big recommendation on Pinterest is the fact that if you simply search something like 1878 fashion, it's not going to give you just 1878. It's not the best at figuring that out, because a lot of things aren't labeled correctly or at all. I like to put that in and then go over to the boards option, and then actual humans will have collected images that match up with that specific year or range. Usually decades are the more typical range that you find. So that's how I start searching on a medium level. I know broadly about where I'm looking. I sort of narrow it into a decade or a few years and start searching through those. If I need more information, I might go over to, say, the Met Museum website where they have a ton of fashion plates by year, or I might go to the HathiTrust website, which sort of combines a search engine for Google Books and for archive.org and some other websites. So you can find just delineator magazine after delineator magazine, which is the more typical clothing styles. It's basically butterick patterns. So there are so many of those from the late 19th century, and it's really thorough, and you can look year by year at not just women's styles, but also children's and men's styles as well, because there are a lot of pictures of children, and that is its own difficult thing to get through. But the key thing here is looking at all these resources. Look at what draws your eye. What makes it obvious and distinct? Is it the collar, the lapel? Is it the trim or where the trim is located that seems a little interesting? Or perhaps it's the sleeve style or sleeve size that really stands out to you. And you can start digging deeper and deeper into figuring out exactly what year. And I know it may seem a little like, why does it matter exactly what year it is? But when you're trying to piece together a family history, it can add up to a lot. Knowing that a picture is from 1897 versus 1903 can make a complete difference in the relationship that you are viewing. Which I'm actually going to show you that exact circumstance. But I first want to start with one of my oldest photographs that I've got. This one is labeled as Joseph and Jenny Hevelon. I know that I have a Jessie Carter in my family history that married a Joseph Hevelon, and so I just kind of assumed that Jenny Jessie, someone just kind of messed up when they wrote on the back of the picture. It's probably a nickname anyway, so who knows. But when I actually took the time to look at it and put a date on it, it got a little confusing. Because this picture is reading 1860s to me. We see a fairly broad skirt, somewhat fitted sleeves, so it's probably not late 1850s or really early 1860s, probably more like mid 1860s, very dropped shoulder. We have the collar style and just the details that really speak to mid 1860s. which wouldn't be a big deal for Joseph because he was born in 1840, so he would be in his mid-20s in the mid-1860s. That makes perfect sense. I can also see that he has 2 children that are born around this time. The first child he has is born in 1866, so that works. However, there's a problem. Jessie was born in 1856. That woman is not 10 years old. That is definitely not Jessie. And when I started to look at records, I found that though she is listed as his wife, and you can see all the children beneath, she would have started having the first child at age 9, and that's not what happened, clearly. So what that means is that this is not Jessie. This is a different wife who likely passed away, and then the marriage record for Jessie and Joseph was in 1876 when she was 20, and that's, much more reasonable. So this is the other mystery wife. Like, okay, maybe it is Jenny then. I'm gonna look up some records for Joseph, see what happens. And I came up on Virginia, which I realized that the reason why I had always missed her before was because in a lot of records she is mentioned as Jenny, but she is Jenny Carter. And the other one is Jessie Carter. I had just always heard of Jenny Carter called Virginia Carter. That's Jessie's older sister. So what had actually happened was that Joseph married Virginia, who went by Jenny. In probably the early 1860s or so, they had their first child in 1866, they had a second child, and then in 1873, Jenny passed away. At that point, Jessie was 18 and probably went to care for the 2 younger children, because inevitably it would have been hard for Joseph to take care of them by himself. The farms are usually really close by, so it made sense that she started to care for them, and then they ended up getting married just 3 years later and having their own family. So that's where the confusion was about who this came from. The next thing for me to figure out was the fact that I had a photograph that was labeled as Jessie. And I had looked and been like, Jessie doesn't look like Jenny, so that might not be them. Because when I started looking at this photograph, which is in my top 3 photographs of the family, this is the Carter family. So Richard and Ellen in the front are the parents, and these are their 6 out of 7 surviving children. Virginia, Jenny, is the one that is not present. Because there's actually 12 years of difference between all of the children, so there's a fairly wide age gap. But this photograph is particularly wonderful because we can actually see how a group of people who are from the same area, the same socioeconomic background, all dress when they have 12 years of difference between the oldest and the youngest child, and then quite a bit more than that for the 2 parents. So this is an example that is pretty rare in certain ways. I started looking into what I thought the date might be. 1880s seemed to be the most obvious because of the drapery on the skirts, the style of the bodices, and the little collars. The sleeves weren't puffy one way or the other. And I settled on something around 1886 or so for this photograph. And you can see that the 3 daughters are all dressed pretty similarly, even though they have a fairly wide difference in age. The gentlemen are pretty similar, even though Manly down in the right doesn't have his coat buttoned. It is meant to button up high. There's still a button and buttonhole really high up. They have very short, tiny lapels that button up at the very top. And all of this is in comparison to their parents, who are dressed a little bit differently. So Richard in front, who at this point in time is nearly 80 years old, he's going to be around until 1890, he's wearing a much older style jacket. You can see that it's actually worn a bit along the edges in the photograph. It's a much longer and lower lapel. He's actually a little out of date. Knowing that he's only going to be around for a few more years after this, he might be old enough that he's not really up and doing a lot anymore. And so buying a brand new stylish suit for him isn't really the most practical thing. This picture, to be truly honest, might have been a let's get a picture of everybody while we're still here sort of situation. Ellen, though, she is still dressed pretty similarly to her daughters. Stylistically, it's a little bit different. And I don't think it's a dated style. I don't think it's an older style because you go back to, say, 1882, and it's a very different style of skirt. It's still not that style of bodice. It looks more like she's just personalized whatever's going on in the outfit. She'd added some lace, some trim, because she perhaps wants it a little fluffier. Her lapel is not that different. It's buttoned all the way down the front. She does have a broader collar size than her daughters, which I'm sure is a comfort thing. And she also doesn't have the drapery, the overskirt, that her daughters do, which I would hazard a guess could very well be the fact that that is a lot of weight and might be kind of tedious to move around in at her age. She does continue to live to 1901, so she's still got a while going, but that still might be just more fabric than she absolutely needs. She's pared it down to just the skirt portion instead of the separate overskirt being added to it. So it might just be adjusted for what she needs and what she personally wants, more so than being out of date in its fashion. One of the reasons why I can pretty definitively say that this is going to be more like 1886 and not a few years later and just everyone's a couple of years out of style is because I also have this photograph of Hannah and her family. So Hannah marries Henry, and they have 3 children. The 2 surviving in this picture are Lucy and Daisy. Lucy is born in 1857, and Daisy is born in 1872. We can look at the style of what's going on in this photograph, and from the clothing alone, I would guess we're looking at about 1888, maybe 1889. You can see immediately that the sleeves are a little bit more puffy on top. This would be appropriate to the late 1880s, early 1890s. The style of the bodices is really appropriate to the late 1880s. There are a lot of very similar examples, and of particular note is Daisy's ensemble, because there is no way you can tell me that this is just a plain simple dress that she's hoping to get a few years of use out of. This is fashion. She has made choices, and they are aggressive choices. And of note, Daisy, born in 1872, would be somewhere around 16 or maybe as old as 18 in this photograph. She looks pretty young. She's definitely going for it in fashion with the bravery of a 16-year-old girl. And you can see even her mother has kept up with the fashion changes. Because Daisy is so fashion forward, and because we can find examples that just look so similar to it, it would seem a little weird that this is a few years out of date. She doesn't seem like the type to be a few years out of date. She seems like the type to be updating and upgrading her clothing as we go and keeping up with that. This is likely 1888, 1889, which means that because the other one is stylistically different, we're looking at least a couple years earlier, so 1886 would make sense for that. I do feel like noting that Daisy is not the only one to take fashion pretty seriously. Her father, Henry, has also really gone for that facial hair. That is a look. That's all I have to say on that. But this is a perfect example of a pair of photographs that allows us to kind of narrow in a little bit on dates because we have restrictions based off of ages. The next set of examples, though, is way more obvious when it comes to this. So we're looking at my great-grandmother, Eva. And this is one of the earlier photographs that I have of her. I have some of her when she's a child, but this is one where it's really distinct. She is posing with 2 of her sisters, Sarah and Alice. Eva is born in 1884, Sarah in 1882, and their half-sister Alice in 1857. This is really distinctly, to me, mid-1890s. You have big sleeves. They're not the biggest they could be, which could be a matter of being a little more conservative on the fashion side, or it could be that it's 1897 and the styles are kind of fading, and so the sleeves are deflating a bit, which makes the most sense considering Eva's age. She'd be around 13 if that was the case. I don't want to push it much further back than that, because not only do I feel like the style would be pretty dramatically different, but as you're going to see, we have quite a few pictures of Eva through the years, and they'd start to stack on top of each other way too fast, and you can visibly see her aging. So this is when she looks at her youngest. I'm guessing, like I said, 1897. The next photograph I have of her is with Edith. I always thought that this was a picture of a sister and a new sister-in-law, because Eva eventually marries Edith's older brother, George. So I assumed that this was around the time that Eva got engaged or married and was getting family pictures taken. But looking at the style of their clothing, looking at the age of Eva and Edith, the style of hair that they have, I don't think that's the case. I think this is around 1898, maybe 1899, and this is actually a picture of best friends who are such good friends they went and had matching gowns made and got pictures taken in them, which is absolutely adorable. See, the Ruch and Rothenberger farms butt up to each other. They're in the same area, and they went to the same church and the same school, so they would have known each other. They're only a year apart in age, so they were best friends before Eva got married and joined the family that way, which also puts a spin on this next photograph that I have, which I think dates from around 1901, based not only off of the fashion, but the fact that we now have Edith and Eva again. They have changed their hairstyle slightly. It's a little more mature. They look a little bit older, like a year or two has passed since the previous photograph. And they are seated with two other young women who are listed as Cora and Minnie. I always thought this was Edith's sister Cora and the Minnie that married a Rothenberger. So what I thought might have been one of Edith's other brothers, because it just happened to be William Rothenberger, and we've got like 15 of those in the family, so I just didn't think anything of it. Well, it turns out Cora actually passed away in 1881, so this is definitely not Sister Cora, and there actually isn't a William Rothenberger in that particular group or generation until you go pretty far over in terms of like cousins way out. So this is another case of friends. And it actually was pretty popular to wear a light or white summer dress to have your graduation in. That would put these girls around 1819, probably the point that they graduated and had a picture taken together, or maybe it was just a group of friends that had their picture taken together. Either way, this is not a family photo, this is best friends. And they all got dressed up together and went to the photography studio in town. Mind you, like all of these pictures I'm showing you are all from the same photography studio whenever it has a label on it, which I just absolutely love seeing it over and over and over again. And you can actually sort of date some of the photographs that I'm not sure on based off of the style of border. I digress. The point is, I'm guessing this is around 1901 because Eva gets married in 1903 and we have that photograph. And so I have the picture of her and George in their wedding attire. She has a little bouquet of flowers. She has a slightly more adult hairstyle. She looks a little bit older again, and this is 1903. So the other photograph could be as late as 1902, but again, hairstyles changed slightly. Gown style has changed slightly. She looks a little bit older. I also have a picture of Edith from around the same time. Same thing, her hairstyle has changed. She looks a year or two older than the previous photograph. The gown style is slightly different. I actually found a comparable gown in a museum, which I think is really cool. So it's very, again, all of these things that they're wearing are really fashionable and really pretty. They're not plain. They're obviously going to be their nicer clothing. This is not necessarily what they're wearing all day, every day. They're definitely not doing farm work in these items, but they have them and they are buying new ones every year. If we have these 4 pictures from Eva and we go spanning 97, 99, 1901, and 1903, we can show 4 different outfits over that time period. So at the very least, she is buying a new and very fashionable outfit every other year. At the very least. So it's not that far out of date. I'm sure part of this is also the fact that she's a teenager at this point. She's going to be changing sizes rapidly, so you gotta keep up with that, but you can adjust clothing, you can change sizes and make alterations. But the fact that I have all of these photos of Eva, and I have quite a few more from later years. Eva was around until 1975, and so I have tons of photographs of her in all sorts of different situations throughout the decades, and she is just such an interesting person. Like I said, she had 4 crazy kids, 3 boys, 1 girl, and they're all just, my great aunt and uncles were just such interesting people. And I was able to collect a lot of wonderful information about the family, but things like the fact that Eva and Edith were best friends before she got married to Edith's older brother. I didn't know that story. I didn't have that information. And being able to put specific years and dates on things and realizing that people are aging and changing and their fashion is changing meant that I could uncover that story in a way that I never would have been able to discover otherwise, because my grandparents' generation is all long gone at this point. I don't have a way to ask them these things. And the family properties have been passed on to other people. I don't have access to those locations anymore. So these photographs and a few names that go with them are what I have left in order to piece together the stories that were never told. It also shows us a little glimpse into the daily life and the wardrobe of a farmer's family in rural Indiana. And there is so much more to be learned out of these photographs than I could possibly have discovered in this short amount of time. And I'll be sure as I discover more interesting things to keep sharing those with you guys. But I've had a really wonderful time reconnecting with my family and hope to keep taking this a little bit further, because you never know what new discoveries you're going to be able to find in these types of photographs. So a fun fact, just above all the things you can see, I have a picture of my grandmother and her mother. The wedding photo we looked at of Eva and George, a random photograph of nobody that I know, and another photograph of Edith.